Welcome to the Chapter 49 podcast. This podcast is being recorded and posted on October 21st, 2021. My name is Larry Lannan. I am a volunteer dealing with communications for Chapter 49 and also a retiree. Welcome you to our podcast, and we welcome those listening and watching on YouTube. We offer it both different ways. I'd like to once again welcome Duncan Giles, our chapter president for Chapter 49.
Good to be here, Larry.
And those of you watching on video can obviously see we do have a guest this week. Doreen Greenwald is a special assistant to our national president, Tony Reardon. So I would like to welcome Doreen Greenwald back to the podcast. It's good to have you back.
Thanks for having me. This is a weekly event for me to watch, so I appreciate all you guys are doing to keep this going. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You know, I torture myself because I have to watch myself, but I only do that to make sure the technical part is okay. And so far, I think we're doing well. Well, Doreen, I'm going to start off asking you a question, and Duncan and I will kind of hand each other off in terms of asking questions of you. But there's no question that the executive order from President Biden and the vaccination mandate has created the most work. I mean, you've got all this work we all have to do as chapter officials, and layer upon that this huge vaccination mandate issue. It's a lot to deal with, but you know we all are up to the task, I think. And I want to start off by asking you about the briefings that the IRS has been giving NTEU at the national level, particularly lately. What have you learned from these most recent briefings?
Well, you know, for NTU's part, we meet with IRS pretty regularly, both on the COVID evacuation and the notices there, as well as now the vaccination mandate. NTU is also working with IRS on the mandate, and it's going to be negotiated. There's a table set up for that, and we're still waiting for some details on that. Meanwhile, we've been getting briefings from the IRS kind of on the status of where employees are at as far as their vaccination status, and also about their plans to address the mandate, how they're gathering data for information, and what other things they're doing to help encourage employees meet that mandate.
So I guess the most recent briefings have zeroed in on what happens next. As far as any employees who may be listening to this on October 21st or some date afterward, do we have a better idea what the employees can expect to go through for example, for if they're applying for reasonable accommodations, or if they have that denied or get an accommodation they don't like, or simply don't want to get the vaccine? Do we know much about what discipline they're going to face, how that will work?
Well, the reasonable accommodation process has kind of been slow to get out to employees. I would best describe that. Initially, they put out some information that gave two different websites, one for if you were requesting a medical accommodation, and one if you were requesting a religious accommodation. And then if people applied for it, they got a canned answer back, basically saying they were waiting for further guidance and couldn't give them much more at that point. Just this week, they dropped two new forms that they are recommending for employees to use. My understanding, I just got some emails today that people are having difficulty opening and accessing those emails. So we'll be working with the agency to say, hey, what's the problem with these, and try and make them more accessible for employees to submit to the two websites that they've identified, or the mailboxes they've identified. We know the IRS has asked people seeking reasonable accommodation to get those in as soon as possible. They've set a deadline of Friday the 22nd to do that. We know that employees can still submit after that date, but they're encouraging them to do it earlier. And so that's been kind of what we've heard on the reasonable accommodation. We've asked the IRS about what comes next. What is the discipline that people might be looking at? We've had some just very general discussions. We know that the goal of the mandate is to protect employees from COVID-19, and the vaccine is currently, based on science, the best way to protect people from death or severe illness. And so that's why it's being pushed. It's not a goal to remove employees. So So there's really a heavy emphasis on trying to get people educated about the vaccine and get them vaccinated before the mandate hits. My understanding of the process in general is going to be initially they're going to counsel people who have not been vaccinated and give them some information about the vaccine. For your listeners and your viewers, I would advise NTEU members to seek out the NTEU webpage. There's an FAQ page that we update regularly based on the latest information. So if you have some questions about that. And also I would advise people, if you're frightened about the vaccine or you don't have good science, there's a town hall video that's on our website. You can find it on the FAQ page. And there is a representative from the CDC who answers medical questions about the vaccines. And I think that will help people address any gray areas they may have. And so going back to the education, and I apologize, Larry, if I'm cutting you off, but then the next step, if it's not education, they're looking to push the mandate by starting out with what we believe will be some form of suspension. Don't know what that's going to look like at this point. And then follow progressive discipline. If the suspension doesn't work, then eventually go to proposing removal.
And I'll get the next question to Duncan Giles.
Yeah, Doreen, this is, NTU represents 34 agencies, I believe we're up to now. And with you being assistant to Tony, you've got to deal with all of these, I would imagine, in some form or another, and be familiar with them. Is what the IRS is doing much different than what a lot of these other agencies are doing, or is most of the executive branch doing pretty much the same thing at this point, getting a certain date, saying you have to be vaccinated by this date? If you're not, then we're looking at education with the counseling. If not, then we go to the progressive discipline. Are they all looking at doing something along those lines?
For the most part, that's correct. What they're doing is following the guidance that has been put out by the administration and the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force that has recommended that. But agencies themselves independently can make decisions. It's recommendations, it's not orders. And so we see some differences in the various agencies about timelines they may be following, the guidance they put out. IRS has been a little slower than some of the agencies, and some of like the reasonable accommodation information coming out. And we're farther along in some agencies about discussions about how maybe discipline will be dealt with, but they're all pretty similar for the most part.
So you mean IRS's snail-like pace is not copied everywhere?
Shocking, I know, but yes.
Well, I do know that there's a difference between executive branch agencies and others. I know, for example, when I worked at broadcasting, I dealt a lot with the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, and I believe that's an agency that NTEU represents. I don't believe they're an executive branch agency, and they're a much smaller, obviously, operation, but are they doing things the same way?
Well, for those who are under the executive branch, obviously they have to follow the guidance from the administration. Those who aren't under the executive branch, we expect to follow under the OSHA guidelines that are expected out later this month. And that's going to require, what we expect is also vaccines or testing of some sort. And we expect that soon. So right now we're waiting on the guidance on that.
You know, you talked about not being able to open up the form. I guess I thought it was just my software that was acting up. Apparently this is a common thing where not everyone could open up these new forms on reasonable accommodations. But I guess I would ask the question, you've already touched on this, but did the form, because sometimes forms will, the way the instructions are written, or just the way the questions are written on the form itself, you can learn sort of what the agency really wants in terms of information and responses. Did you, as a union, learn anything once those forms were released?
I don't think the forms were surprising. I think it kind of lays out the process as far as, obviously, people are seeking an accommodation from getting the vaccine. And so if you have the medical format, it kind of walks you through why you would not be able to get the vaccine. And then for the religious reasons or closely held religious belief, it kind of walks you through that thought process. So while the forms aren't required, I think it does give employees a good understanding of what the agency is going to consider as they look at these reasonable accommodation requests.
Duncan, I'll bring you back in.
Yeah, one of the things I want to touch on is I think now we've got to have an emphasis on the status on HR Connect. Because previously, when it first came out, NTU was, both locally and nationally was saying, you don't need to do it because, it'll just be showing that you haven't been vaccinated and you'll be treated that way. But since the executive order, they are now saying you have to put in your status. And my understanding is that on HR Connect now, there is something that says that if you are putting in for reasonable accommodation, that there is a status for that. But if you do not update your status on HR Connect with this to exactly where you are in the vaccination process, it's my understanding that they could say that you're not following a lawful order by doing this, and you could face punishment right from the get-go from that. Is that correct?
Well, they haven't talked to us about punishing people for that per se, but they are viewing it as an order that they've directed employees to complete their attestation or their vaccination status on HR Connect. And when they first rolled it out, as you said, Duncan, initially they kind of asked people, you could put in unvaccinated or you could decline to answer the question. And then they quickly turned that around after the executive order and said, we need you to complete it accurately. And so the agency is really, IRS is taking an effort to try and get people to update that status. So we've seen some direct emails to employees saying, hey, you're on the system as either declining to answer, we need you to update it, or you haven't responded, we need you to put your status in there. And as we learned yesterday from the agency, they intend to do some calling of employees directly to their work phones to tell them, hey, you're not in the system and you need to get in the system. Now, I assume they're going to probably go through a series of events to try and get people updated and push that. At some point, if people just fail to follow an order, you're correct, Duncan, they may look at discipline if that keeps happening. So, but right now the push is, still education and to get people in compliance with the order.
Right. And one thing I do want to add on the trouble with the forms opening, I was hearing right before we started this podcast, it's a Explorer versus Edge type issue. So it works on Explorer, wasn't working on Edge. I don't know if that's absolutely correct or not. But people were saying I could do it on the computer, but not on my phone. So that's just something for folks to look at if they want to take a look at these forms. And those forms are on the NTEU website. They're on the IRS FAQs where it talks about vaccinations. So those forms are out there and available. And I would advise folks to fill them out post haste if they're going to submit that.
So people are still using Explorer?
For the federal government on the computers, some of our stuff doesn't work with Edge. So yes, we are still using Explorer.
I didn't even know Explorer you could still use it. So I guess I've learned something here today. Let me bring Doreen back in here because Doreen, there's something that Duncan and I have talked about in the past in our podcast, and I do want your comments and view on this. And that's what the timelines. I mentioned this earlier that we've got some quick timelines coming up. I think many employees, when they find that they get themselves into a situation such as not wanting to be vaccinated or waiting on a reasonable accommodation request, or it's denied, or the accommodation is not acceptable, any of those things, what people have normally tried to do in the past is use this, for example, the appeals process to just delay the decision. Duncan and I have been talking about this. Duncan is fairly well convinced that the agency is going to do something they rarely do. They're going to speed this process up. And usually it takes weeks or months sometimes to get an appeal all the way through the process. That he feels like if you are an employee and you feel like you can just kind of stall this out for a while, that strategy may not work when it comes to the vaccination mandate. I'd very much like to hear your views on that.
Well, as far as the timelines go, obviously the agency we talked about, they want the reasonable accommodations in place by Friday, but they have to accept them after that effect. I do want to touch base on those forms. If people submitted before those forms were available, from what IRS is saying, you don't have to start the process over again. So I just want to clarify that for people, because some might be waiting there thinking, oh, now I have to redo a form. And that's one thing, some agencies are making people start over. So there are some differences in agencies with that. As far as the timeline goes, if you have a reasonable accommodation pending, right now, I believe the volume of the requests is going to dictate the timelines. I mean, obviously the IRS wants to respond to these as quickly as possible, but there's a process they have to go through. They said they're going to reach out to individuals, gather the information. They're going to have a board look at some of those and make some decisions. So how long that takes is going to be heavily dependent on the inventory, the queue of how many people have submitted these. And so that's going to drive it. If it's pending, people will be okay. I mean, they're not going to start taking disciplinary action until they get a final decision on that. And then the process will go forward from that. If people are denied, or if people have not submitted or done nothing, they've just decided I'm not getting vaccinated, no matter what you say to me, I think there will be efforts to move that along. They're going to, like I said, try to educate people, give them an opportunity. And then they're going to seek discipline. People are still going to have their rights to respond to that discipline, and that process will take that course. But yes, I think there's an intent here to live up to the mandate, and I believe they're going to try and enforce it and follow the steps as quickly as possible. So I agree with Duncan in that aspect. They're not going to want to delay this indefinitely.
Duncan, I'll bring you back in again.
Yeah, one of the things I did want to touch on the forms, because I was reading the fine print right before we did this podcast, in both the medical and religious, if you're filing for reasonable accommodation, it does say that if you are denied, whether you're going the EEO route or the grievance route with NTEU, that discipline can proceed while your appeal is being done, basically. So I would think that that's going to also impact how people will be moving forward. Wouldn't you think, Doreen?
Oh, absolutely. And I know that's a discussion that is at the negotiation table as far as the vaccine mandate, how some of these timelines are going to work. If you're denied, what kind of time frame do you have to, get your shot or your first shot? When will you be expected to get your final shot? All of those things are at discussions right now. And I don't know that we have the final answers to that yet. But it's important that people understand what's going to be expected of them and how this process will go forward. But I think you're right, Duncan. I mean, once somebody is denied, they're going to be advised to get the vaccine, and then, each action will take place. And again, everything the agencies keep telling us is that the goal here is for the safety of employees and not to discipline them. Right. So if any time throughout this process, somebody says, you know what, I've learned something, or I've changed my mind about the vaccine and I'm going to start getting the vaccines now, the agency is willing to hold off on taking disciplinary action to allow them to comply with the mandate. So, we're going to have to see how this plays out, but the intent here is to keep people safe. And NTEU does not want to see people disciplined or lose their jobs over this scenario.
Absolutely.
And Doreen, I know that part of this process, although it's going very quickly, is for NTEU and the IRS to reach an agreement on the impact and implementation of this. Are we any closer to that, or do you have any ideas on what timelines you're looking at to get that done?
Well, I know there's a team in place, and they're really kind of waiting right now on the IRS to explain what their policy is. As you correctly stated, Larry, this is impact and implementation. This is not negotiations over the decision to mandate this vaccine. That decision is not part of this. And so how the rollout of this is going to be negotiated. And we need the agency to tell us their intent and how they plan to roll it out, so we can address some of those things at the table. And right now, my understanding is we're still waiting for some final guidance from the agency about some of the questions like on discipline or the timing. of those things, and then they'll finish that. So, and I will state to you as well that the vision here is that's not going to change the deadline date. The deadline to get vaccinated continues to be November 22nd. So even if there's some questions still out there, or they're still in the process of negotiating, that's not going to change that date, and it'll wrap up post-implementation if necessary.
Looking at all this, the executive order, what's come after it, this all deals with the one J&J shot or the 2 shots for Pfizer and Moderna. Now we have booster shots for Pfizer and Pfizer, I should say, and Moderna and J&J are expected to get approval for boosters in the near future. Do you expect any complications from the booster shots in terms of government policy?
Well, right now we're kind of waiting to see, what the CDC recommends, because that's what the agency is following. So we know earlier in October, the CDC recommended for specific individuals a booster shot for Pfizer. We expect to see something similar coming out of Moderna and J&J probably later this week or next week. What we haven't seen is changes to what is considered fully vaccinated. So even though for certain people with maybe health conditions or in frontline positions of, identified like nurses, et cetera, boosters are recommended, they have not changed their guidance as far as what's considered fully vaccinated. So as of today, because I want to be clear, as of today, things change with science. Boosters are recommended for people, but it's not part of the requirement, not covered by the executive order at this time.
Duncan, any final questions on this issue for Doreen?
I just want to expand a little bit. Boosters is one of those things that we actually had a great deal of discussion at the bargaining table for the new national agreement. And if the CDC does recommend booster shots and you do fall under those guidelines for those who should be getting boosters, you should be getting time for the agency to be able to go and get those booster shots, as well as if there's any adverse reaction to it, any recovery, up to 2 days of recovery time to, basically get yourself back together after the reaction to the shot. Would you say that's accurate, Doreen?
That is accurate. Now, Duncan, you were on at the turntable when we negotiated boosters. We all saw this coming, that we thought boosters would probably be necessary, wanted to make sure there was language in that contract to protect employees who needed it. And so the contract language does address that you'll get administrative time for the booster as well as travel to and from the booster. What we also know, and we've emphasized with our discussions NTEU has with OPM, is we want clarification to the agencies to make sure that recovery time, like we're seeing for the initial vaccines, is available, the up to 2 days if you have any reactions or recovery time necessary from the boosters. And to my knowledge, OPM has agreed, and they will be putting out additional guidance to agencies. So that should resolve any of that concern. But from what I'm hearing, anybody who has applied for boosters, and really right now we still have only seen the Pfizer booster for certain individuals, they've been making those requests, and under our current contract language have been getting approved.
I have one last question on this issue, Doreen. One thing that, in my experience years ago, being a union official and even a manager, is that no matter what you try to do, when you have a program as big as a vaccination mandate, there are always unforeseen circumstances that come up and you have to deal with them. Have you discussed that with the IRS? How are you going to react to these unforeseen circumstances, either with your talks with IRS or just talking internally within the NTEU staff, as how you might react to circumstances that come up that you cannot foresee right now?
Well, I think IRS kind of approaches everything as an unforeseen circumstance, to be honest. But I mean, for example, I think we have been doing that. The boosters is something that's come up. I think, the mandate in itself, we've had to address it with the IRS's efforts to hire. How does it impact new hires when they come on board? Will they be vaccinated? What do they tell people? How much time do they have? We work through an issue with employees who are released right now that are seasonal employees that would have to come back. So, you know, the IRS had to make efforts to, we said, how do you communicate with them? How do they know? How do they learn about the reasonable accommodation process since they're not able to see their emails? So, you know, we've learned that they've sent letters to them and advised them of some of this information. So yeah, there's always with every program some unforeseen things. And, you know, people like Duncan and our other chapter leaders across the nation raise this stuff regularly with NTEU, and we're in constant communication with the IRS, kind of helping identify those issues and walking through those and working through those issues so employees aren't stuck with their hands in the air going, now what do I do? We want to be ahead of that if we can avoid it.
Yeah, I love that quote. IRS thinks everything's an unforeseen circumstance. I don't know.
April 15th comes as a surprise every
year,
to us.
right?
And then there's October 15th, but we'll leave that alone. Because everybody seems to have offered an extension these days. Any final comments or questions for Doreen before we move on vaccination mandates? Duncan.
I think we've covered it pretty well. I would urge every NTEU member to hit the NTEU.org website because the FAQs are updated regularly. They are very, very informative, and they go more in depth than the IRS information does, and is updated much quicker than the IRS information is. So I would absolutely urge any member to go there.
Yeah, and Doreen, I'd like to compliment the National Union. I think that the way that the Q&As are put together on the NTEU.org website for the people who are members, very easy to read and put in the proper context. So I think it's much, if you read that, you get a much better feel for exactly what is and is not required. Anything that you would like to add on this subject before we move on?
No, just another plug for the town hall video for the CDC scientist. Really, if people want to know some information about the vaccines because they're scared about them or concerned that, you know, they've read some bad information, you know, we try to deal with science and facts. And I think that does a really good job of kind of breaking through some of the myths out there and answering real questions that people have forwarded out of concern. And it's worthwhile taking a view of that if you want to learn more.
Yeah, we did place that on our NTEU Chapter 49 Indiana Facebook page. So and it got quite a bit of attention. So I think people are watching that. And that was a very good decision to put that up on your website as well at the national level. Doreen, I'd like to ask you about something everyone is concerned about every year. It's pay raise. And this is the first time in many years, I myself as a retiree will get a higher pay raise than employees. It doesn't usually work out that way because of inflation rates and so forth. But right now, as I understand it, the House has passed a pay raise. The Senate has been silent, which keeps the pay raise at the same rate as the president has proposed, which, as I understand it, is a 2.2% across the board raise and 0.5% to be shared on locality pay. I know we've talked to Kata Sabenga, who heads up your legislative department, and talked about how the department deals with that. What are you hearing from your lobbyists on Capitol Hill? Does it look like the pay raise will be at that level? I know there are a few people in Congress pushing for a higher raise. Where do you think this will go when we hit the finish line soon?
Well, Larry, I think you presented it well. I mean, we're at the 2.2 plus the locality. So on average, 2.7. That gives us pay parity with the military. I think the administration and Congress is probably comfortable at that level. NTEU is not. We are pushing still for the FAIR Act at 3.2%. And we're not going to be counted out until we're at the finish line, and we're going to keep pushing until we get there. Tony tells a story very passionately that, you know, in past years, NTEU has always continued pushing for increased pay raises for our members, and we've been successful when others have given up. So there's no give up in this fight. We're going to keep pushing for the 3.2.
Wanted to give you a chance to make that case, and I know that's been that's been the position of the union all through this process. Duncan, anything on pay raise?
No, I echo and applaud Doreen's comments about what NTEU does. And it's, as we've talked about before, it's very easy for folks, members, to go on the NTEU website and let their congressperson or senator know that they want the higher pay raise. It just takes literally moments to send that letter to them. And, they do listen. So it can never hurt. And it's your money. It's your pocketbook. If you want a higher pay raise, do that. I would say that's the best thing that members can do right now to try and influence this.
And speaking of money, I know that just following Duncan's blow-by-blow account of what happened in the national negotiations for the national agreement with IRS, that awards was a very big issue, and the awards pool is at 2% of salary, I think it is, or general payroll, which is a very high number. And that money will be coming out in the next about 2-3 months. Talk about what we know about the awards payout coming later this year, Doreen.
Well, we're pleased, as Duncan has shared with you, we were very pleased to get a floor for awards of 2%, starting with the new contract. Now that's for fiscal year 22 awards. But for FY21, we are also getting 2%, which is excellent, which will be a great increase for employees. And we're expecting them this quarter to be paid out, hopefully towards the end of November, sometime mid-December. We don't have an exact date yet. That money is well earned by employees who have really done an outstanding job keeping the organization operating through a pandemic, through switching over to telework, doing all the great things that they did. IRS's biggest asset is its employees. And this is the first time in many, many years that awards are starting to recognize the contributions that employees have. And so I'm excited that employees are going to see those increases in their awards for this fiscal year and then starting again in 22. And the language actually says a minimum of 2%. So we're hopeful in future years to keep it going up because, as I said, employees earn this. They work very hard for the agency despite the obstacles, despite the fact that they've been short of resources for years. They still deliver. And so awards are the best way to recognize employees.
Yes, Doreen, I just told my wife yesterday how lucky I am that I retired 10 years ago, seeing what all you folks are dealing with. It's just amazing the work that has been done by employees at the IRS and other federal agencies. Any comment on awards, Duncan?
I was very pleased that NTEU was able to talk to IRS and have them understand that it would be very good for everybody concerned if they started the 2% for the fiscal year 21. And I'm very glad that NTEU was able to get that accomplished with the IRS, because I think it, as Doreen said, it's very well deserved.
Well, Doreen, we spent most of our time on the vaccination mandate, which, Duncan and I have also been spending the lion's share of our time on these podcasts the last several weeks on that as well. I'm just going to give you a chance to just make any comment about any issue you want, anything you would like to say before we wrap the podcast up.
Well, I just want to thank you for inviting me on. I think you guys are doing just such an awesome job addressing the real life issues that NTEU members are dealing with. And while, yes, we spend a lot of time on the vaccine mandate right now, that's front and center for most employees. Employees who are vaccinated, who are concerned about possibly having to return back to the workplace and not be safe, and those who are concerned about the vaccine itself. And so we try to give everybody as much information as we can. As I said, we try to follow the facts and the science and be there to support our members. And so all I would say to everybody is we are a union for a reason. We are united in a common goal to look out for the dignity and respect of federal employees. And so through this all, we will get through it and we will be in a better place at the end. And so keep communicating with each other and keep talking about things, because that's how we solve problems.
A lot is said about union contracts, but I remember in my early days of working at IRS, when I became an NTEU member, I just looked at that contract and saw that language that every employee of the IRS is entitled to dignity and respect, and thought that's in the contract. It's a commitment that the union wanted the management to make, and that was no small commitment. So that when you say that, Doreen, it is not just something IRS and NTEU encourages IRS to do, it is in the contract language and has been in that contract for a very long time. Duncan, anything you would like to say before we say goodbye?
Well, if we're going to be hitting dignity and respect, the folks on the phones right now and the folks in the tax, there are an awful lot of upset taxpayers. Understandable, because they can't get through on the phones. It's tough for them to get an appointment because of, there are so few employees. You don't have to take any abuse. I just want to again emphasize that to employees. You don't have to take any abuse. If a taxpayer is getting irate, is starting to curse you, starting to yell, ask them to stop. If they don't, you are absolutely entitled to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disconnect this call if you can't talk to me rationally. You absolutely have that right. And any chapter president or chapter leader across this country will back you up on that. So don't feel you ever have to take abuse, because we're not going to let you stand alone, and we're not standing for it.
Well, Duncan and I are both alumni of working on the telephones. I was a taxpayer assistance center manager. In fact, the man who succeeded me ended up being physically assaulted, which, was just an awful thing to happen for an employee or manager, either one. So what Duncan says is very important. Doreen, thank you so much for being our guest today. And I think you have something you want to add.
I just want to add and kind of mirror what Duncan said. We throw around the words dignity and respect, and what NTEU really does is try to bring that to life. It's not just words on a paper. And what TAS is going through, the employees in TAS, and the huge ballooning inventories, NTEU is working with TAS to try and get at the heart of that. The bottom line is, while a lot of people want to blame it on the pandemic, the fact is IRS has been starved of resources, and there just aren't the people to do the work that is necessary. And so we're, the administration and the Build Back Better legislation to try and get more money for the IRS, and not just in appropriations, but going forward to really address the starvation that has occurred of our agency over the years, is very important to members. And so keep that in mind. We're all working towards a goal. NTEU is there fighting on all of those fronts for employees, so that they feel that they are treated with dignity and respect. It's not just words. So thank you again for your time.
Oh, thank you. And Doreen, we could do a whole podcast and more just on the recruitment challenges IRS is going to have in the coming years, along with a lot of other agencies. So you touched on some things that brought lots of questions to my mind, but we are going to have to wrap this up. Our time is we're over time already. Duncan, thank you for being here again. And Doreen, thank you so much for joining us again. You always have very important comments and information. We hope you'll return at a future date.
Anytime.
Thank you so much. And my name is Larry Lannan. I am a volunteer here at Chapter 49, and I'm the one who produces these podcasts. And we do thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy it. If you like it, let other people know, and we would hope to grow the audience. It has been growing over the last year and a half. My name is Larry Lannan. Thank you very much for listening and watching the Chapter 49 podcast. And please be safe and be kind.